The evening sun bathed the street in soft golden light as Clint Eastwood pushed open the door of the small restaurant on the corner of the city. He was 94 years old, but he moved with confidence, albeit a bit slower than in his youth. His dark blue jacket hung loosely on his shoulders, and an old baseball cap shaded his eyes. The place was crowded. The air was filled with a mixed scent of coffee, sizzling bacon, and cheap air freshener. Clint passed a group of young people laughing loudly in the corner and sat at a table by the window. "Excuse me, sir, but you can't stay here." Clint raised his eyes. A young waitress stood before him, blonde hair tied up in a messy ponytail, and her wrinkled apron had a name tag that read Lori. She looked tired, but her eyes had a cold, distant expression. "Excuse me." Clint leaned forward, resting on the table. "You can't sit here," Lori repeated. "We have rules about customers' appearance." Clint slowly ran a hand over his beard, as if processing her words. "And what's wrong with my appearance?" "We have a dress code. Jacket, jeans, sneakers." She paused briefly, casting a dismissive glance at his shoes. "This doesn't meet our standards." Clint squinted slightly. "Standards? I'm just here for a cup of coffee." Lori nervously glanced around, as if checking to see if the manager was watching. "Sorry, sir, but I have to ask you to leave." Clint looked at her intently. His gaze was firm, but not hostile. "I'm not here to cause trouble. If you want me to leave, fine, but first bring me a cup of coffee." Lori bit her lip, hesitated for a moment, and then took a step back. "Okay, a cup of coffee and you'll leave." Clint nodded. Agreed. She went to the coffee machine. Clint stared out the window. The darkness was slowly descending outside, and pedestrians hurried home. He ran his hand across the table, feeling the cold, smooth surface, and remembered how many years ago he had sat in a similar place with his wife. "Here's your coffee." Lori's voice brought him back to reality. She placed the cup in front of him, and Clint noticed her fingers trembling. He took a sip. The coffee was hot and strong, just the way he liked it. "Thank you," he said calmly. "After this, you'll have to leave," Lori reminded him. "We'll see," Clint replied quietly, taking another sip. Lori pressed her lips together and went to another table, but occasionally cast worried glances in his direction. Clint stayed where he was, staring out the window. His presence was clearly causing some tension. But he wasn't going anywhere, not just yet. "I already told you that after your coffee you need to leave." Lori's voice became firmer as she approached the table. Clint slowly set his cup down on the saucer. "And I said after dessert, I'll leave." Lori gritted her teeth. "This is not a joke. If you don't leave now, I'll have to call the manager." Clint looked up at her, his gaze calm but penetrating. "What if I order dessert? You wouldn't throw out a customer while he's eating, would you?" Lori inhaled sharply, holding back her anger. "Our shift is almost over. You can't just—" "Cheesecake," Clint interrupted her. "With whipped cream if you have it." Lori stared at him, surprised. "Are you serious?" Clint nodded, a faint smile appearing on his lips. "Yes, seriously. Dessert, and then I'll go. I promise." Lori took a step back, looking at him once more as if trying to figure out what was going on in his head. She sighed in frustration and went to the counter. Clint watched her leave calmly. His hands remained still on the table, but there was a hint of sadness in his eyes. A few minutes later, Lori returned with a plate holding a slice of cheesecake topped with whipped cream. She placed the dessert in front of Clint, barely concealing her irritation. "Your cheesecake. And I mean it, after this, you'll leave." "Definitely," Clint replied, picking up his fork. He cut a small piece and slowly put it in his mouth. The cheesecake was cold, a bit sweeter than he would have liked, but overall not bad. Lori stood nearby, arms crossed over her chest, staring at him without taking her eyes off him. "Why are you doing this?" she finally asked. Clint looked up at her. "What do you mean?" "Refusing to leave." You're just sitting here, dragging your feet, as if you're waiting for something. Clint slowly ran the tip of his fork around the edge of the plate. And what if I really am waiting? Lori pressed her lips together. I don't want this to become a problem. Clint smiled softly. Is it already a problem? Lori didn't reply, but her face tensed. She glanced over her shoulder again, as if checking to see if any managers were watching them. Clint cut another piece of cheesecake and slowly put it in his mouth. Let me finish my dessert, and I'll leave. Lori frowned. I don't trust you. Clint smiled slightly at the corner of his mouth. That's the right decision. She shot him an embarrassed glance, but said nothing. And yet, Clint leaned slightly forward, his expression turning more serious. Let me finish my dessert. Lori stood still, the tension between them growing. Finally, she nodded. Fine. But if you don't leave after this, I'll call security. Clint didn't respond. He simply continued eating his cheesecake, as if nothing extraordinary was happening. It was clear this was just the beginning of the game. And Clint knew the rules better than it appeared at first glance. Clint calmly ate his cheesecake, but when Lori turned to another table, he slowly pulled his phone from his pocket and dialed a number. This is Clint, he said quietly, holding the phone to his ear. Yeah, I'm here. I think you should come in. He placed the phone on the table and took another bite of cheesecake, ignoring Lori, who was busy at the neighboring table. The cafe doors opened a few minutes later. A tall man in an expensive suit entered. His movements were confident, and his gaze was cold and attentive. A few patrons glanced at him. Lori noticed him as he crossed the room and headed straight for Clint. Her face darkened, and she quickly approached them. Sir, she started, but the man raised his hand, silencing her. Clint looked up and calmly nodded. Long time no see, Henry. Clint, Henry sat across from him without breaking eye contact. What are you doing here? Clint cut a piece of cheesecake and slowly put it in his mouth, chewing with deliberate indifference. Having dessert. Henry leaned forward, his gaze becoming sharp. This isn't your style. Maybe I just missed the local cuisine? Clint smiled. Lori looked at them, confused. Do you know each other? Henry didn't answer, but his jaw tightened. Lori, Clint said, not taking his eyes off Henry. Please bring me a coffee. Black. And another slice of cheesecake. Lori didn't move. I don't think this is a good idea. This is not a request, Henry said quietly, never breaking his stare with Clint. Lori bit her lip, shot them a wary look, and walked back to the counter. So, Henry turned his attention back to Clint. Why are you here? Clint lightly tapped his fork on the plate. I heard you bought this place. Thought I'd check it out under your management. That doesn't answer my question. Clint shrugged. Just curiosity. Henry leaned in closer, his voice turning quiet and cold. If you came back because of that issue, forget it. It's the past. Clint smiled slightly. You know I'm not that sentimental. Then what's the deal? Clint looked at him, a sharp glint appearing in his eyes. I think you've got a problem here. I handle my problems myself. Clint leaned closer, barely noticeable, smiling. We'll see. They exchanged a brief look. The tension between them was almost palpable. Lori returned with the coffee and cheesecake, carefully placing them in front of Clint and glancing at Henry, waiting for some reaction. Clint raised his cup, took a sip of coffee, and nodded in approval. Not bad. Henry stood up, but before leaving, he leaned closer to Clint and said, Don't start this again. Clint didn't respond. He just smiled as Henry walked to the exit, and the door closed softly behind him. Lori stood by the table, looking at Clint with confusion. What was that? Clint looked at her, his smile softening. I told you, just dessert. He picked up his fork and cut another piece of cheesecake, as if nothing had happened. Clint put down his fork, carefully wiped his lips with a napkin, and looked up at Lori. She stood nearby, slightly tense, her arms crossed over her chest. "You know, Lori," Clint said quietly, "I was wrong." She glanced at him, surprised. "What?" Clint stood up from his chair, took his wallet out of his pocket, and placed several bills on the table, much more than the coffee and cheesecake had cost. "Sorry about all this." "Scene." He looked up at Lori. "You were just doing your job." She still looked on edge. "And what was that all about?" Clint smiled slightly. "A business meeting. It's over now." He leaned a little closer to her. The coffee was great, and the cheesecake too. Lori couldn't help but smile, though she still looked a bit confused. "Well, thanks." Clint nodded and headed for the door. But before opening it, he stopped for a moment and turned back to her. "By the way, Lori," his gaze softened but remained attentive, "don't worry about Henry. He has everything under control." She pressed her lips together but nodded. Clint stepped out onto the street, and the cafe door quietly closed behind him. He took a few steps down the sidewalk, pulled out his phone, and dialed number. "Yeah, it's me," he said when the ringing stopped on the other end. "The meeting went well. Yeah, he understands everything." He paused, staring at the gray sky above. "It'll start soon," he said quietly and slipped the phone back into his pocket. The wind caught the end of his coat as he walked down the street, disappearing into the crowd. Clint walked down the sidewalk, his hands shoved deep into the pockets of his coat. The street was bustling, people hurrying to work, someone walking their dog, and a group of teenagers laughing loudly by the bus stop. Clint moved through the noise calmly, as if it didn't concern him. He turned into a narrow alley between two buildings and pulled out his phone. A message from Henry appeared on the screen. "Everything's ready. Waiting for your signal." Clint typed a short reply. "Wait. I'll take care of it." He slipped the phone back into his pocket and paused for a moment, leaning his back against the cold brick wall. In the depth of the alley, a rustling sound echoed. Clint tilted his head and noticed a figure appear in the shadow between the buildings. "I didn't think we'd meet this soon," Clint said, his voice steady. A man in a dark cloak stepped into the light, hands hidden in his pockets. His face was partially concealed by a hood. "You've gone too far, Clint," the voice was hoarse low. "You should have stopped when Henry warned you." Clint slowly straightened up, removing his hands from his pockets. "Henry warned me? Henry follows orders. I give them." The hooded figure took a step forward. "Are you sure you have everything under control?" Clint smiled. "I always have everything under control." The cloaked man stopped just a step away from Clint, eyes gleaming from beneath the hood. "We'll see how long that lasts," he said, before turning and disappearing into the shadows of the alley. Clint watched him go, then pulled out his phone and dialed Henry again. Yeah, he was here. Clint paused for a moment. "It's time to move to the next stage." He put the phone back in his pocket, adjusted his coat, and stepped out of the alley onto the main street. The sun broke through the clouds, but a cold glint flashed in Clint's eyes. He moved forward, as if he knew exactly what to do. Clint walked down the street with a confident stride, his hands in the pockets of his coat. He approached a black sedan parked by the sidewalk and got into the back seat. Henry was at the wheel, nervously gripping the steering wheel. "How did it go?" Henry asked, keeping his eyes on the road. "As expected," Clint replied, removing his gloves. "They made the first move. Now it's our turn." Henry nodded and started the car. "Do you think He won't do anything until we make the first move," Clint interrupted. "And we'll make it tonight." Henry silently pulled out into traffic, the car smoothly blending into the flow of vehicles. Clint looked out the window, watching pedestrians cross the street, rushing about their business. They had no idea anything was happening. "Shall we start at the cafe?" Henry asked. Clint smiled. "Yes, they think they're in control. It's time to show them they're not." Henry turned onto a quiet street. Clint took out his phone again and typed a message. Ready. We start at 9 p.m. The phone almost immediately lit up with a response. Understood. He put the phone down and leaned back in the seat, staring into the distance. Henry, are you ready? Always, Henry replied, turning the wheel. They stopped in front of a building with dark windows. Clint got out of the car, buttoning his coat, and approached the door. They were waiting for him. The door opened, and a man in a dark suit invited him inside. Clint stepped in, quickly scanning the room. It was quiet, the only light coming from a dim lamp illuminating a massive oak desk. Behind the desk sat the same man in the cloak he had met in the alley. Now without the hood, his face was fully visible. He smiled. Impressive. You really went through with it. Clint sat down across from him, placing his hands on the table. You underestimated me. Mistake. And what exactly do you plan to do? Clint leaned forward, his gaze darkening. End the game. The man in the cloak smiled again. Then make your move. Clint raised his hand, and the sound of a door opening echoed through the room. Henry entered, followed by two men in black suits. They stood on either side of the table. What is this? The man in the cloak asked, his smile fading. Clint stood up. This is the end of the game. He nodded at Henry. Henry stepped forward. You've taken on too much, he said quietly. The man in the cloak gripped the armrests of his chair. You're making a big mistake. No, Clint replied, walking out of the room. I'm correcting yours. The door closed behind him. Clint stepped outside, where Henry was already starting the car. Clint got into the back seat and checked his watch. 9:03 p.m. He smiled. Everything's under control. The car drove off, disappearing into the flow of city lights.